Welcome to medieval England, where the sun rose reluctantly. The streets were paved with mud, and life expectancy hovered somewhere between unlucky and non-existent. Before you settle in, check your torch, kick off your boots, and maybe imagine a faint drizzle on your face, because chances are, if you were alive back then, you were wet, cold, and confused most of the time. Let's begin with the morning. Not your modern, vitamin-fused, yoga-enhanced type of morning. No, this was the kind of morning where you woke up not to birdsong, but to the sound of livestock arguing outside your window. And by window, we mean a square hole in the wall that let the wind in and nothing else out. Privacy was a luxury, and insulation was called hoping for the best. People didn't really wake up in bed. They woke up on straw, in corners, under benches, sometimes next to people they didn't remember meeting. The air smelled like firewood, goat, and a very old cabbage. No one brushed their teeth. That was considered suspicious. If your breath didn't cause someone to flinch, were you even from the village? You'd rise with a grunt, rub your eyes with a hand that probably just pet a pig, and step out into the day wearing clothes that hadn't been washed since the previous monarch. Most villagers owned 2 outfits, one for work and one for being buried. Sometimes it was the same outfit. You didn't change clothes, you committed to them. Breakfast was not a meal, it was a concept. If you were lucky, it was porridge grey, pasty, flavourless, and somehow both too hot and too cold. It was made of oats, water, and resignation. Sometimes a beet was involved, rarely on purpose. Bathing was for saints and royalty. Maybe the average peasant bathed when it rained sideways and they tripped into a ditch. The upper class bathed ceremonially, which meant pouring wine on themselves while their servant wept silently in the background. Soap existed, but it was made of animal fat and ash, and it smelled like someone had lost a bet. Now, the streets, if they could be called that. Mud, manure, discarded bones, and suspicious puddles, these were your footpaths. And shoes weren't standard. Most people wore wooden clogs, or just hoped for the best. Walking through town was like navigating a battlefield designed by pigs. If you tripped, you didn't ask for help. You pretended you meant to examine that rat and moved on. Commerce was simple. You had something. Someone else wanted it. You bartered. Maybe it was eggs for fabric. Maybe it was fish for beer. Maybe it was 3 turnips and a lie. Currency was rare and usually frowned upon. If you were flashing coins around, people assumed you either stole them or were about to be robbed of them. Possibly both. Speaking of fish, let's discuss the diet. Medieval food was less about taste and more about survival. Bread was hard, meat was occasional, and vegetables were either turnips or theoretical. Spices were a sign of wealth. If your stew had flavor, someone important had died recently and left you their pantry. Dinner was often the same as lunch, which was the same as yesterday's dinner, which was found growing something new. You didn't ask what was in the stew. You didn't ask how old the bread was. You ate, you nodded, and you prayed it stayed down. Most villagers didn't own forks. Forks were for the French. Spoons were fine. Knives were normal, and fingers were expected. A full meal involved slurping, chewing, and at least one person choking slightly. If you were eating with nobility, it meant you were either very lucky or about to be arrested. Water was suspect. Wells existed, but so did dead animals. Streams looked clean, but weren't, so most people drank ale weak, sour, barely alcoholic, but safer than the invisible death swimming in the water bucket. Children drank it. Grandmothers drank it. Even the monks drank it, though they pretended it was spiritual. Let's move to health, or the lack of it. Doctors were few. Actual knowledge was rarer. If you were sick, they bled you. If you were feverish, they bled you again. If you were still alive, it was considered a miracle and a sign that the stars were aligned. If not, well, at least your clothes could be reused. Hospitals were churches. Medicine was prayer. The most trusted treatment involved herbs, honey, and confident guesses. Toothache must be demons. A cough, probably too much night air. Pregnancy, hope for the best, and boil the midwife's apron. Teeth were considered optional. Most people lost them by 30. Smiles were small. Dentists didn't exist. You either lived with the pain or visited someone who claimed to be good with pliers and didn't ask questions. Now, let's talk about entertainment. Because yes, somehow, they still had it. Music was played on lutes, flutes, and other instruments that sounded like wounded geese. Dancing was frantic and unchoreographed. Games involved dice, guessing, and a lot of arguing. Sports were violent and confusing, and most of them ended with someone losing a tooth or a friend. Festivals were chaotic. The whole village showed up. People wore masks, drank heavily, and pretended it wasn't raining. There were plays, often religious, with more passion than talent. The actors shouted, the audience heckled, and someone always tried to kiss the priest. At night, everything stopped. Torches were expensive, candles were rare, and firewood was guarded like treasure. Most people went to bed when the sun did, not out of discipline, but because the dark was full of things that bit, scratched, or whispered your name. Doors were bolted, windows were stuffed with cloth. The animals were brought inside, not because you loved them, but because you didn't want them stolen. Your sheep slept closer than your spouse, sometimes warmer too. The sounds of the night weren't peaceful. Dogs barked, owls screeched, rats held meetings. If you heard footsteps outside, you stayed still and hoped they weren't yours. If you heard singing, it was either a ghost or someone who didn't understand how thin the line was between joy and heresy. And yes, the church. It was everywhere. Bells rang constantly. Monks walked in silent judgment. Priests preached about hellfire while quietly selling indulgences to sinners who could afford them. Salvation had a price, and it was usually negotiable. Life in medieval England wasn't about thriving. It was about getting through the day, surviving the stew, avoiding the rats, and keeping your shoes on in a town where even the ground wanted you dead. It was hard, dirty, and short, but it was also full of quiet victories. A warm fire, a loaf of bread that didn't bite back, a night without screams, and on rare, miraculous days a smile. So now, as you close your eyes and imagine the world of wooden doors, muddy roads, and villagers who measure wealth in goats and gossip, remember this. You made it through mud, porridge, superstition, and song. And if you dream of bells ringing, stew bubbling, and a rooster that hates the sun, don't worry. That's just medieval England whispering its sleepy chaos to you. Sleep, if it came like a drunk friar noise, stumbling and gone before morning. You didn't rest, you paused. And when the rooster screamed, which it always did before the sun was legally allowed to rise, you got up and did it again. The day began not with joy, but with noise. Chickens fighting under your stool. Children running somewhere they shouldn't. A neighbor yelling about a missing bucket like it was a national emergency. Everything was loud. Except the things you needed to hear, like taxes. Ah yes, taxes. That special medieval invention designed to make sure you never got too comfortable. You paid taxes on land. You paid taxes on grain. You paid taxes for crossing bridges, using roads, and occasionally for existing on a Wednesday. And if you asked where the money went, they showed you a new cathedral and told you it was for your soul. The taxman didn't come alone. He came with guards, a ledger, and the kind of expression that said he hadn't smiled since the last coronation. If you couldn't pay, he took a goat. If you had no goat, he took your tools. If you had no tools, he wrote your name down very slowly and told you to pray harder. Either way, you left the conversation poorer and significantly more annoyed. The local lord, of course, lived up on a hill. Always a hill. He had stone walls, real windows, and possibly even a chair with a back. You rarely saw him. He was too busy hunting, feasting, or trying not to marry a cousin. His job was protection. Your job was everything else. Justice in town was swift, confusing, and public. Trials were more performance than process. If you stole a chicken, you might lose a hand. If you were caught lying, you might wear a wooden mask shaped like your sin. There was one for gossip, one for gluttony, and one for being too cheerful on market day. You didn't argue with the system. You just avoided eye contact and tried not to sneeze near authority. If you wanted to settle a dispute, there were options. You could challenge someone to trial by combat, which was just an excuse to fight in public. Or you could do trial by ordeal, which was a lot like trusting your fate to the opinions of a rock. They might dunk your head in a pond to see if you floated. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were a witch. Either way, you weren't having a great afternoon. Witchcraft was a default explanation for anything confusing. Bad harvest. Witch. Sick cow. Witch. Storm on a feast day. Witch. Your bread didn't rise. Must be the neighbor's wife, the one who hums while weaving and doesn't blink enough. You didn't need proof. Just suspicion, some smoke, and a vague testimony from a nervous shepherd. The more confident your accusation, the more people nodded along. Marriage was not about love. It was about goats, land, and whether your family thought the other family bathed occasionally. You got married young. You stayed married unless someone died or vanished mysteriously during mushroom season. Romance existed, but mostly in the form of passing glances and shared cider. Kisses were rare. So were teeth. Children were everywhere. Not because they were loved, but because birth control was imaginary and winters were long. Kids worked as soon as they could walk. They carried buckets, chased pigs, and learned that silence was suspicious. School was a rumor. Most learned from their parents or the village priest who taught letters, numbers, and how not to die in Latin. The church loomed large, bigger than your hut, stronger than your will, and always watching. Monks copied books by hand, muttering prayers and swatting at flies the size of turnips. The Bible was in Latin. Only the clergy could read it. Everyone else just nodded and hoped the sermon ended before the stew burned. Sunday was sacred. You wore your cleanest shirt, combed your hair with a fork, and stood in a pew trying not to fall asleep. The priest talked about sin, virtue, and why you should stop dancing in the fields. Bells rang so loud they cracked the sky. And afterwards, you repented by drinking, which somehow made it better. The seasons ruled your life. Spring meant planting. Summer meant sweating. Autumn meant harvest, and winter meant surviving. Everything was done by hand. You dug with wood. You ploughed with oxen. You planted in rows and prayed that the sun would be kind and the locusts wouldn't show up for lunch. And even when the harvest was good, it was never enough. Famine came like an old friend, invited, unwanted, and far too comfortable. Bread got smaller, stew got thinner. People looked at squirrels like roast chickens with long tails. You ate bark, boiled shoes, or found a merchant who claimed to have dried apples and definitely didn't. Hunger shrank everything except your temper, and then came the plague. Not every year, but often enough to be remembered. You didn't need a doctor to tell you. You knew it by the silence. First the coughing, then the stillness. Doors closed, windows stayed shut. Black crosses were painted on wood. Bells tolled too often, and the gravediggers stopped asking names. No one understood it. Some blamed the air. Others blamed sin. A few blamed the Jews. The church encouraged that. Fear does strange things to people. Priests led processions through muddy streets, whipping themselves, begging God to stop. He didn't, not for a while. When the plague ended, life continued. That was the rule. Always. You buried the dead, wiped your hands, and went back to planting. Beans. No one talked about it. No one had time to. You lived, or you didn't. Either way, the pigs still needed feeding, and somehow, through all of it, laughter existed. Not loud, not proud, but quiet. Muted jokes in the tavern, a carved puppet, show on feast day, a song sung off-key by a girl who'd stolen apples and didn't care. People found joy not because they were fools, but because they had to. Without joy, the mud one, the tavern, was the center of this fragile happiness. A crooked room with a crooked table, a barrel pretending to be a chair, and a fire that smoked more than it burned. Ale was poured, arguments were had, and someone always sang. The songs made no sense. They were about sheep, kings, wars, and love that probably never happened. But they were loud, and that was enough. You drank what was offered. You smiled when it burned. You left your coins, or you promised them. And if the barkeep liked you, he'd pretend to believe you. The tavern wasn't safe, but it felt warmer than the church and smelled better than your neighbor. That counted for something. Night came again. It always did. The sky darkened with quiet authority. Fires flickered. Shadows stretched. You shut the door. You bolted it with wood and prayer. You listened for wolves. You ignored the creak of floorboards, telling yourself it was wind, not something worse. You laid back down, on straw, on dirt, next to a dog, under a blanket that might have been a curtain once. And as your eyes closed, you thought about nothing. Not the taxes, not the hunger, not the graveyard with fresh dirt. You thought only of warmth, of one more morning, and somehow, impossibly, you slept. The moon spilled silver across the timbered beams, as if the heavens themselves strained to witness what stirred within the oldest room of the brothel. Ilva's quarters were silent now, save for the quiet breath of wax candles burning low, and the wind curling through the shutter cracks like the whisper of forgotten lovers. She stood there before a cracked mirror, still in her linen shift, brushing tangles from her long golden hair, the color of ripened wheat. Her face, beautiful, yes, but lined faintly with something older than age, was blank tonight. Not sad, not pleased, not afraid, not hopeful, just still. The brothel had emptied, or so it seemed. Most of the girls were asleep or curled up with their coin, or with men too drunk to stagger home. But Ilva remained standing, staring into herself. Behind her, on the wooden table, lay a single coin, thick, gold, real, and cursed. She'd seen it before. Not that exact piece, but the symbol etched upon it, an eagle devouring its own tail. Not Roman, not local, not from any merchant purse she'd ever picked or kissed her way into. That symbol meant only one thing in her world. The whispering caught a name that lived in rumors passed between gutter snipes and Bacchali whores. A circle of nobles and priests and executioners who traded secrets like spices and sent girls like Ilva to places from which they rarely returned. Why, LVA had not seen that mark in 5 winters until now. Outside, a cart creaked by, hooves on cobblestone. A dog barked somewhere distant, but none of that lived in her ears. Only the ringing silence of memory. 5 winters ago. She had taken such a coin and followed it out of poverty only, to witness what lived behind the city's velvet curtains. Blood magic, masked priests, girls tied to golden chairs, and whispered prayers that chilled the air. She had escaped, barely, through tunnels that stank of rot and sulphur. She had hidden in plain sight since then here, in the most visible place. Of all, a brothel where secrets were traded for groans and silver, where no noble looked for shadows, and every whisper was masked by moans. But now the past had found her again, and she had to decide, run or face them. A knock, not heavy, not hesitant, measured why LVA turned. Slowly, the door creaked open, and in walked Mother Calder, draped in her mourning shawl, cheeks flushed from drink or anger or both. But her voice was sober. "There's a man downstairs," she said. "He's not one of ours. He asked for you by name." Ilva's stomach didn't drop, it coiled. "What name?" she asked. "Not Ilva." The pause told her everything. "I else Beth." That name hadn't been spoken in this place. Not once. She left the brush on the dresser, took the dagger from beneath her pillow, the one hidden in the silk case embroidered with flowers, and slid it under the folds of her belt. No rouge, no perfume. She descended the creaking stairs without a word. Each plank beneath her foot seemed to cry out warnings only she could hear. At the bottom, the hearth flickered low. A single man sat at the table, back to the fire, who'd drawn. Around him, the other patrons had cleared out, paid, left, vanished. The air smelled not of sweat or mead, but something fainter, incense. Myrrh. He did not look up until she stood before him. "Then Ilsbeth," he said, voiced quiet and even, "daughter of the weaver, disappeared from the hill of bells 5 winters ago." Her heart did not quicken. Her hands did not tremble. She met his gaze. "You speak too freely for a man who wishes to leave with all his fingers." The man's lips curved. Not a smile, just a recognition. "Your mistress will be paid double," he said, sliding a leather pouch onto the table. "You'll come with me." "Why would I?" He uncurled his gloved hand. In his palm lay a ring, iron, simple, set with a cracked red stone. She knew it. It belonged to Jorma, the only man who had ever protected her before she fell into this life. A brute, a thief, a drunk, but loyal to a fault. And dead. She had seen him die. So how did this man have his ring? The visitor stood. He was tall, not armored, not robed, but robed in something like silence itself. His cloak barely rustled. His eyes were grey. "He's alive," the man said, "and he's asking for you." Ilva's throat burned. "I saw his body. Did you?" She didn't answer. A soft shuffle echoed from the stairwell. Other girls now peeked over the rail, eyes wide with the taste of danger. None of them spoke. YLVA turned back to Mother Calder, who stood in the kitchen's half-light, her hand resting on the curtain. "Will you stop me?" Ilva asked. Calder shook her head. "I never stopped you before." And with that, Ilva followed the stranger into the fog. They crossed the city beneath a crescent moon, weaving through alleyways slick with moonlight and memories. The man did not speak. He moved like a shadow born from stone, past the tanner's yard, past the old plague pits, past the statues half buried by ivy, and timed on until they reached it. The temple of the hollow flame. It had been abandoned for years. A ruin, shunned even by rats. Ilva stepped through its stone arch with her dagger close and her eyes wider than they had been in years. The brazier inside flickered to life, and there, in the flickering red glow of burning herbs and black oil, stood a figure cloaked in black, bound at the hands, face bruised at unmistakable HJALMAR. His one good eye snapped open when he saw her. His voice cracked like old leather. "You shouldn't have come, girl." But it was too late. The doors shut behind her, with a sound like steel on bone. And above them, in the galleries of that forgotten temple, masks began to appear, white porcelain faces with hollow eyes. Watching, she had returned to the circle she thought she'd escaped. Only this time, she wasn't running. The smell of crushed sandalwood lingered in the corners of the dim corridor as footsteps echoed softly over old stone. In the hushed hours before dawn, when Norbog wore her velvet silence like a bridal veil, there came a procession through the narrow halls of the eastern quarters, one that did not clang or shout, but whispered its arrival in hushed commands. Swishing silks and low torchlight flickering across jade-colored walls, Lele stood still, just past the arch of her chamber, her breath tight in her chest. She watched them pass not palace guards this time, but the eunuchs of the midnight summons. They carried scrolls and sandalwood, and a crimson sash. Her heart knew before her name was spoken. "Lele of room 9, came the voice. It was soft, almost fatherly, but there was no warmth. "The Nawab requests your presence in the southern gardens." Not his chamber, not the bathhouse, not the opium room. The gardens. She bowed in silence, knees brushing the cool marble. Behind her, Parveen made no sound, but Lele felt her grip on her shawl tighten. The gardens at this hour were not made for love or laughter. They were made for plotting, for watching, for silences too heavy to name. And yet she obeyed. She walked barefoot down the red stone steps, escorted by the eunuchs in single file, their shadows stretched long by torchlight. The moon overhead was pale and bloated, hiding behind drifts of monsoon cloud, and the fountains no longer sang. They waited. Under the black nine tree, the Nawab stood cloaked in gold-trimmed wool despite the heat. His eyes, dark and ringed with insomnia, stared not at Lele, but at the western wall where birds once nested. Only one man stood beside him, a general, or perhaps an astrologer. None of the others spoke. "You've danced well," the Nawab murmured without looking at her. "Too well, perhaps." Lele's breath caught. She bowed again, lower this time. "My lord honors me." "I do not speak of honor," he said. "I speak of danger." The general leaned closer and whispered something into the Nawab's ear. He nodded, slow as a man burying a memory, then finally turned to her. "They say the poet Hakim has written verses for you." She froze. "That name, that sin. I have not seen him, my lord, but he has seen you," the Nawab replied. his words have weight. Men die for less. The silence that followed was thick as molasses, stretching long across the gravel path and into the orange blossom trees. Somewhere nearby, a peacock screamed. "I want you to read something," the Nawab said, and the eunuch stepped forward with a sealed scroll, read it aloud. She did dot each line unfurled like the silk of her own sorry painfully familiar. She dances with shadows under lanterns of rose, whispers fire into silver cups, and no one knows. But I have seen her, O midnight's bride, and I would burn the sun to stand at her side. The air around them stilled. The Nawab stepped close to close and his voice dropped into a growl. "Tell me, is that not you?" "I cannot say," she whispered, voice trembling. "The poet writes in riddles. Perhaps he speaks of another." But they both knew he did not. The general stepped forward now, holding something small and sharp, a tiny scabbard with an ivory handle. A gift, or a threat. "You will return to your quarters," the Nawab said. "You will prepare a letter for Hakim, a farewell letter." Lalaire's blood ran cold. "You will write it in your own hand. You will seal it with jasmine oil." And if I smell deception, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The eunuchs led her away, slow and silent. When she reached her room again, Parveen sat waiting like a statue at the edge of the bed. She had already laid out the paper, the ink, the vial of oil. A single candle flickered on. The side table, casting long shadows that stretched like prison bars across the carpet. Layli took the brush, but the words would not come. How does one say goodbye in a palace where even whispers echo forever? Where the walls remember every footfall, where even the wind carried secrets. She wrote slowly, pausing between every line. Tears blurred the ink. Somewhere in the far corners of the chamber, an old flute began to play, soft, distant, mournful. By morning, the scroll was sealed, and Layli did not sleep. Asterisk, asterisk, the days that followed were strange and hollow. She danced with the others, but forgot her footwork. She sang, but let the notes trail off into silence. Even her laughter, once so crisp and bright, sounded like someone else's voice. Hakim did not return, but his verses did. They began appearing in the unlikeliest places, scratched into the bark of fig trees, hidden in folded napkins on silver trays, murmured in coded riddles by bathhouse servants. They spoke of longing, of rebellion, of fire beneath cold waters. The other girls noticed, and the Nawab noticed them noticing. A storm was brewing. Parveen urged caution. "Let the words pass," she whispered. "Men come and go, but the walls remain." But Layli could not. One night, just past the third watch, she crept alone through the unused hallway that led to the old watchtower. A place servants swore was haunted, but Hakim had mentioned it in one of his riddles, where the moon meets iron and the fig splits in three. There she found it, a torn piece of cloth tied to a rusted window latch, and a letter beneath a stone. "Layli, I will not run from fire. I will wait in it. Meet me where the fountains forget to sing. Midnight, the night after the mango moon." She read it again and again. The mango moon that was 2 nights from now. She clutched it to her chest, heart racing, and vanished into the darkness once more. Asterisk, asterisk, but Nurbog was not built for escape. It was built for containment. In its beauty were locks, in its poetry barbed wire. The Nawab, it seemed, had eyes everywhere, and so, the day before the mango moon, the dance troupe was summoned to the audience hall. Not for performance, but for judgment. They stood in 2 neat rows, each girl in full attire, eyes lowered, servants lined the walls, guards at every corner. The Nawab sat above them, flanked by his advisors. The general, the vizier, and Parvenu stood a step behind, quiet and unreadable. He asked no questions. Instead, he recited a verse from Hakim, the same one he'd shown Lele. Only one among you, he said slowly, could inspire such fire in a poet's heart. So which of you will admit it? Silence, the kind of silence that curdles in the lungs. The Nawab's hand lifted, and behind the column stepped a new face. Hakim shackled, bloodied eyes, bright even through bruises. Gasps escaped the girl's lips. Even Parveen wavered. Do not lie, the Nawab hissed. He has already confessed his muse walks among you. Hakim said nothing, but his eyes found Lalez for a single breath, and in that heartbeat, everything fell apart, because in Nurbog, to be seen was to be condemned. The sun rose pale behind a gauze of Saharan dust, streaking Cairo's skies in tired gold and thinning rose. In the courtyard of the House of Whispering Jasmine, life returned, not with the call to prayer, nor the murmur of markets, but with the soft splash of water in stone basins and the distant hush of sandals gliding over worn tiles. The girl called Amira stirred beneath her veil of linen, her lashes fluttering like moths caught between dreams. She no longer belonged to the life. She had known bare feet in alleyways, dates snatched from baskets, the sharp laughter of girls with no masters. That life had peeled from her like old bark. What remained now was fragrance and stillness, and the careful arrangement of movements meant not for herself, but for watching eyes. She had learned the silence between songs, the stretch of breath, before the ord strikes its first chord. Lady Halima, who governed the harem like a soft storm, had taken a strange liking to her, curling a protective wing around the girl, even as others watched with narrowed coal-lined eyes. She learns like rain on stone, Halima told the others. Not loud, but lasting. Amira no longer flinched when perfumed fingers adjusted her robes, nor when strange hands painted her lips with crushed roses. She'd come to know the rhythm of each morning, the rising smoke from the brazier, the bitter temps of coffee poured into delicate silver-rimmed cups, the aching wait before being summoned. Each hour was a note in a melody no one had ever written down, but that day began differently. There was no laughter from Yasmin, or teasing hums from the twins in the embroidery chamber. The older concubines gathered in low clusters, whispering. In Syriac and Armenian, their voices frayed at the edges with tension. Even Halima seemed strained, her fingers tightening around the ivory handle of her fan. A guest had arrived the night before veiled, draped in silks of foreign weave, flanked by 2 eunuchs with blades curved like crescent moons. No name had been spoken aloud, but the air had thickened as if it recognized him. The corridors had been swept thrice. Incense burned until the walls sighed smoke. The youngest girls had been hidden, and now Amira stood, still and waiting, her arms glistening with scented oil, her hair coiled into braids like chains across her scalp. The scent of sandalwood was dizzying. Her heart beat not in her chest, but in her throat. She was not summoned, not yet. Instead, Halima took her by the wrist and guided her deeper into the garden chambers, beyond the marble lions and whispering fountains until they reached the old bathhouse sealed long ago. The air here was cool and secretive. Moss curled in the cracks. A single candle sputtered. You are not for him, Halima said, her voice low but firm. Not yet. Amira looked up, startled. Why? Because the lion does not eat the fruit it has not watched ripen. Halima touched her cheek with the back of her hand, maternal and fleeting. You are still ripening. And with that, she left Amira in the echoing hush of the bathhouse. Its pools drained, its stories fossilized in the steam-worn tiles. She waited there for hours, not moving, listening, distantly, laughter forced, brittle. Then silence stopped by nightfall. The guest had left, and a cloak of weariness draped the house of whispering jasmine. Candles were extinguished quickly. Doors closed with more finality. Amira emerged with quiet steps and padded through the corridors, unseen. She was not seeking mischief, just air, just answers. But as she turned a corner near the eastern colonnade, she heard it, a sob, faint, crushed under someone's breath. She peered through the carved wooden screen and saw Yasmin, one of the older girls, doubled over in the corner, her silk robes stained, her braid undone. Beside her, blood darkened the marble floor. Amira stepped back, her body moving before thought could anchor it. She turned, ran, but her feet made no sound. She was wind, she was shadow. She reached her chamber, shut the door, and pressed her back against it, her lungs aching with something deeper than fear. She did not sleep that night. At dawn, the courtyards were washed. The blood was gone. Yasmin was gone, and no one spoke her name. Life resumed with mechanical grace. Oud players returned. Servants sang again. The rhythm stuttered only slightly, and then it picked up pace. But Amira had changed. Where once she moved with the blind obedience of a girl seeking approval, now she studied. She watched how the others glanced toward the master's chamber, how some wore extra jewels when summoned, while others hid trinkets in their sleeves. She learned that kindness was rare, that envy could wear a smile, and that no one, not even Halima, could protect everyone. Yet Halima still tried. You will not end like the others, she whispered one morning as she threaded golden cords into Amira's robe. Not if I can help it. Why me? Amira asked. Why do you care? Halima paused. Then she said something Amira would remember for the rest of her days. Because once someone tried to save me too, she failed. I won't, that day. The master's steward appeared with a scroll bearing Amira's name. She was to perform that night, not for the guest, not for the court, for him, the master. No one said his name aloud. Not in full, in whispers, they called him the Falcon. He who never married, he who spoke little but knew all, he whose gaze turned concubines into queens or ashes. Amira did not weep, nor did she smile. She bathed in petals and wore a robe of sheer gold. Her hair was scented with ambergris. She carried a tambourine with silver bells, though her hands trembled as she held it. Halima walked her to the marble door, and there she paused. Whatever you see, she murmured, do not let it change your spine. Stay straight, stay breathing. Then she pushed the door open, and Amira stepped into the lion's den. The chamber was unlike any other in the harem. No silks, no music, just stone, cool and ancient, lit by braziers that painted shadows onto the mosaic floors. In the center, on a raised dais draped in panther skins, sat a man cloaked in black. His face was hidden behind a lattice veil of golden threads. He did not speak. Amira stood before him. She began to dance, not like the others did, with fanfare and coyness, but like smoke rising from a censer. Every step deliberate, every turn restrained. Her bells whispered rather than sang. He did not move, but when she paused, chest heaving, he lifted one hand. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a gesture of curiosity, of command. "Come forward," he said, voice deep, neither cruel nor kind. She got closer. When she stood within reach, he raised his veil, and she saw his eyes. They were not cruel, but they were not kind. They were old. They had seen too much. He touched her cheek with the back of a gloved hand. "Not yet," he said. And then, just as quickly, he turned his face away. "Leave," she obeyed. Halima waited outside, her breath tight. "What happened?" he said. "Not yet." Halima exhaled, a sound part relief, part confusion. "Then we wait." But from that night onward, the house of Whispering Jasmine was no longer a place of safety. It had become a chessboard and a mirror piece in play. The afternoon sun dragged slowly behind the sloped roof of the Guildhall, casting long, sleepy shadows across the dusty courtyard. By the hour, the heat dimmed and the alleyways began to breathe again. In the brothel's inner chambers, where incense still clung to the walls like stubborn ghosts, the rhythm of the day shifted, not to rest, but to readiness. Yara knelt beside a shallow copper basin, rinsing her hands in warm, rose-scented water, her wrists still bearing the faint traces of the ink she had used earlier, runes and charms. From a traveller who had requested more than pleasure, her eyes trailed upward to the latticed window where the thin light shimmered through woven silks. The world beyond remained muffled and far away. Only within the house did the real pulse of the city live. "Tell me again about the woman from Astara," whispered Jorah from her bed of cushions, her red-painted nails idly trailing across the edge of her goblet. Yara smiled, wiping her hands. "She had a tattoo of a serpent curling up her spine," she said softly, her voice like poured honey. "She came not for men or coin, but to hide. Her eyes were always watching the door, even when she laughed. She paid well. She paid in sapphires," Yara answered, "and secrets." The girls listened in silence, scattered in languid poses across the chamber. Myra was plaiting her own hair, long and glossy like riverweed, while Nasira watched through half-lidded eyes, her hand loosely clutching a string of prayer beads, though no one ever heard her pray. Downstairs, the sound of the door creaking open echoed like a warning. New visitors, boots on tile. A brief exchange in whispers. Then came the voice, thick, deliberate, foreign. "Is she here?" A silence followed. The madam's voice, steady and unmistakable, rose through the quiet, the air tensed like a drawn bowstring. Yara rose slowly and crossed to the curtain, pulling it slightly to the side. 3 men stood below. The first wore a crimson sash across a polished leather vest, gold rings stacked on his fingers like trophies. He did not look around like a man in search of comfort. He looked like a man tracing a name. Jorah muttered, "That one smells of soldiers." "Worse," said Mira. "He smells of collectors." Yara did not speak. She was already calculating. Her mind danced between faces, passages, safe words, and locked chests. She did not know the man, but his eyes had lingered too long on the staircase, as if he already knew the layout, as if he had once been inside, or was told by someone who had. Nasira stood now, wordless, slipping on her velvet robe. She moved to Yara's side, brushing the curtain aside farther. "Do you want me to distract him?" she asked simply. "No," Yara said. "I want you to follow him when he leaves." "He won't be alone," Nasira replied. "I'm counting on it." Down below, the negotiation began. "You run a fine house." "But I'm not here for games," the man said, looking toward the curtain with purpose. I want the one who reads futures in wine and stains secrets into skin, the one they call Yara. The room behind the curtain grew motionless. Even the beads on the drapes seemed to still their sway. The madam gave her most practiced laugh. Smooth, polite, dismissive, oh my dear. They call every third girl in the city that. What would you pay for a name that common? The man smirked. I'd pay what her life is worth, and a little more for silence. Yara stepped back from the curtain. I'll go, she said softly. No, Jorah and Mira said in unison. Yara raised a hand to silence them. I'll go, but only to listen. She moved like smoke, gliding down the narrow servant staircase, not the front, and circled behind the receiving room. She did not enter through the doorway, but emerged from behind a hanging veil near the hearth. Her presence so sudden it startled even the guards. I hear you seek a woman who sells truths, she said evenly. The man turned to face her, and his face changed. Just for a moment. Not surprise. Recognition. You're older than the description, he said. And bolder. Yara smiled. That same delicate, unreadable expression she used with men who underestimated her. And you're still vague, she said. Speak. Clearly or leave. This house does not trade in riddles. He motioned to his companions, and they stepped back, not far, but enough. You once read futures for a caravan bound for Abenhall, he said. 4 years ago. Yara's smile did not fade, but a flicker in her eye betrayed the crack. You said the road would be red before it turned green, he continued. You told a man with one eye that he would not live to see the 6th mile. He died on the 5th, and the others, all of them, they blamed you. You remember now, don't you? Yara was silent. You told a truth that cost them everything, he said. And now, I've come to offer you one last chance to lie. Yara looked at him long and slow. I remember the caravan, she said, and I remember the warning. But I did not paint the roads red. They bled because they were greedy, not because I spoke. He stepped forward, and this time, his voice carried steel beneath the velvet. You're going to come with us, or they will. His gaze drifted up toward the chamber above, where the women had gathered at the windows like quiet shadows. Yara felt her breath steady, not quicken. She had known, deep in her marrow, that the past was never buried deep enough, and now it clawed its way back in the form of threats veiled as choices. You will leave now, she said, and tell your master that I do not serve men who carry the dead behind their tongues. The man's jaw tensed. I'm not asking, and I'm not pleading, she replied. The next word you speak will determine whether you walk out or are carried. He sneered, and for a second it seemed blood would answer the question, but then he laughed, a short, cruel laugh. Very well, he said, backing away. You're braver than most who read bones, but bones break. He turned, motioned to his guards, and they disappeared into the dust-choked alley without another word. Yara stood still for a long time, only moving when she felt Nasira's hand. On her shoulder. He'll come back, Nasira said. I know, Yara answered. And when he does, Yara turned, her face unreadable again. But this time, it was not to veil fear. It was to veil purpose. Then we'll write a future in fire. The sky above Vienna smouldered like a cooling ember, pale orange bleeding into soot black, as if the heavens themselves were torn between prayer and punishment. Bells tolled from the spires of Stefan's Dom, long and low, like a solemn breath dragged through cathedral lungs. But beneath the solemnity of sacred bronze and prayerful stone, life churned, hungry, bristling, unrepentant. Inside the walls of the old Jewish quarter, Judenplatz there, lingered a silence too perfect, too polished. To be trusted, it was not the quiet of peace, but of dread hanging by its fingernails. Lanterns swung gently above cobbled lanes, casting yellow crescents on doorways long since sealed, on windows darkened not by night but by absence. The quarter, once vibrant with debates, festivals, laughter, and the incense of Shabbat suppers, had turned hollow in organ with its pipes pulled out. Only one soul now walked the alleys freely. A boy named Elias, his coat too large, his boots too stiff, his eyes too knowing. The Gentiles called him the shadow child, not out of affection, but because they feared how he moved, soft-footed and invisible, like some grim reminder of what Vienna had tried to forget. He belonged to no master now, no parent, no rabbi. The synagogue had burned. The school stood locked. The baker who once gave him crusts had vanished. Yet Elias wandered on, as though searching not for a home, but for the echo of one. Tonight he reached the iron grates near the ruins of the mikveh, ritual bath. Beneath the broken stairwell where water no longer flowed, Elias crouched. A sackcloth was pulled aside, and from beneath emerged two more children Safru, and its sock shivering and thin, their hands inked with dust and candle soot. They patrol. Less on Thursdays, Elias whispered, not boastfully, but with that practiced quiet known only to the hunted. Sifra nodded, lips trembling. We still heard them. Down by Fleischmarkt, a man screamed. Elias's gaze didn't falter. Then we wait till the bells stop. Each child reached into the sack for a crust, a rind, a crusty root. No one spoke of what tomorrow would bring. To speak of the future was to tempt fate, and fate in Vienna had become a cruel merchant demanding much, giving nothing. Meanwhile, beyond the Jewish quarter, the salons of the elite glittered like frost on glass, splendid and cold. At the Imperial Palace, Countess Helene von Arnsdorf listened to a quartet play Vivaldi in a salon soaked with lavender and longing. She sipped cordial from a glass so thin it sang when tapped, but her thoughts were not on the music. Her eyes flicked to the painted ceiling, the triumph of the archangel over Leviathan, and then to the polished doors, where her footman had whispered something strange only hours earlier, that a child from the quarter had left a scroll at the rear garden gate. No name, no plea, just the scroll. The Countess had not opened it, not yet now, beneath the music. The scroll burned in her drawer like an ember in silk. Helene, raised on Goethe and Gospels, remembered her mother's words. Vienna must shine, even if it eats its own to glow, and glow it did. While children starved, Vienna glowed up by midnight. Elias had risen again. He left the others with a gesture, 2 fingers pressed to his lips, then to his chest. From his coat, he retrieved a folded page, the last of the letter he had not dared to send, not to a judge, nor a priest, nor even the emperor himself. He was only a child. But he had memorized the words. If the world forgets us, then let us be remembered by its silence. If they tear down our homes, let the wind remember where they stood. And if no justice comes, then may the stars bear witness, and the moon keep count. He had written it not in Hebrew, but in German, careful and deliberate, as he had once been taught by the rabbi before the doors were barred. This was the copy he had left in the Countess's garden, but he had another, folded tight and wrapped in wax, which he now placed into the hollow behind the mikveh's lowest stone. He packed earth over it and smoothed it with his sleeve. not for safekeeping, but for testimony. At dawn, guards moved in. Rumors had spread of contraband, of insurgents. Hiding among the ruins, of forbidden prayers whispered at wells. The city could not bear such whispers. Sifra was caught first, her shawl a poor disguise against the scar of her dialect. Its sock fled through the lanes, ducking through slaughterhouse alleys, but a boot caught his ribs. Both were hauled to the steps of the Rathaus where they were questioned. Elias watched from behind the fountain of Neptune, knuckles white. He didn't flinch, didn't cry, not even when Sifra screamed. Instead, he moved, not toward them, but toward the palace. He reached the Countess's gate by midday. The guard, recognizing the boy from the letter, stepped back, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of guilt. Countess Helene was summoned. She came dressed in mourning black, not for fashion, but for her dead husband, lost in a duel over a lie too old to matter now. Her eyes, however, were alive with frost. "You," she said, arms folded. "You brought the words." Elias nodded. "Why?" He said nothing. Just held up another scroll sealed. This time Mand handed it to her. It was blank. She frowned. "Is this a joke?" He finally spoke. "That is the future, unless someone writes something better." Then he turned and left. The Countess stared at the blank page long after he'd gone. She opened her drawer, unrolled the original scroll. The words burned through her, words a child should not have written. Words Vienna would never allow to be spoken from its polished pulpits. She did not burn them, not yet. That night, she attended a gathering of the court. Amid lace gloves and powdered wigs, she leaned close to Chancellor Habsburg during a toast and said something strange. "You've forgotten the quarter, and Vienna forgets nothing without price." The Chancellor blinked, chuckled, and called it a whimsy, but the Countess never smiled. Meanwhile, Elias returned to the Mikveh ruins. Itzhak and Sifra were gone. Only a blood-stained ribbon remained. He took it and wrapped it around his wrist. He would write no more letters. Vienna did not read letters, but it would remember stories if whispered carefully, by moonlight, in places where lanterns dare not. Glow dot, he would become a story, a whisper, a shadow. And perhaps, one day, when Vienna finally listened, it would hear what it tried so hard to silence. The hour was late, but the brothel did not sleep, not truly. It pulsed like a living creature, sometimes a sigh, sometimes a whisper, and now a tremor. Mist pooled at the base of the city walls as a humid breeze slipped through, half-shuttered. Windows curling into silk drapes and snaking along the floorboards. From outside, the soft clatter of hooves echoed briefly against cobblestones, then stopped. The door did not creak, nor did the knocker fall. But still, Madame Lysandra knew someone had arrived. She stood at the top of the red-carpeted stairs, her robe the color of dried wine, her arms folded like a sorceress waiting for her incantation to unfold. Her eyes didn't blink. Below her, candlelight danced upon the lacquered banisters, flickering shadows up to the ceiling like reaching fingers. It was quiet, too quiet. Then a whisper, subtle disturbance in the stillness, merged from the far end of the hall. It was Isabetta. Her eyes were rimmed red, but not from sadness. Something else. She had not wept. She had been listening. Listening through the thin cracks in the walls to what the soldiers had spoken when they thought the girls were asleep. Names, prices, treachery. There were whispers of a noblewoman coming under false name, of money moving hands like snakes in the dark, of something happening at the palace, a changing of masks, of guards, of allegiances. And tonight someone was coming who must not be seen. Not by guards, not by the city. He's already here, she murmured, stopping before Madame Lysandra. Lysandra nodded once. She did not need to ask who. From a secret side passage, a panel shifted open with a hush, and a figure stepped through into the brothel's warm candlelight. Cloaked, hooded, his boots mud-stained from the gardens, not the streets. He had come not by the gate, but from the tunnels. Isabetta's breath hitched. The man lowered his hood. Prince Marius, not dead, not exiled, not vanished, as the rumors had said, but very much alive. His face bore weeks of wear, with a thin scar, now cutting across his jawline like a sentence left unfinished. And yet, his eyes burned, as they always had, clear, calculating, royal. Madame Lysandra offered no courtesy. You shouldn't have come here. Then why did you keep the door open? He replied. Isabetta couldn't move. Her fingers trembled as though some deep part of her had been waiting for this. Not the man, but the meaning, the cause, the collision of everything that had lived in the shadows of their wall's power, secrets, and rebellion. Do they know? You're here, Lysandra asked coldly. No. Do you know why you're here? This time, his voice lowered. Because I don't intend to return to the palace. Not the way I left it. He looked directly at Isabetta now. Not like a prince to a courtesan, but something older, something binding. The way ghosts look at those who remember them. I need your help, he said. The room breathed. Even the walls seemed to draw closer to listen. Say it again, Isabetta. Murmured, I need you. Not your disguise, not your painted lips. You, Isabetta, shook her head faintly. And if I refuse, I'll walk back through that tunnel and burn it behind me. Lysandra stepped forward then, her face a calm veil, but her hands trembling. You bring danger here, Marius. Not just for yourself, for all of us. For every girl whose name is only whispered, for every servant who pretends to forget. I bring a chance, he replied, if you'll take it. There was a silence. Then Isabetta turned. Follow me, through the winding corridors of the brothel, beyond the velvet. Halls and perfumed parlors, deeper than any patron had ever gone, she led him. Past wine cellars and hidden vaults, until they came to a chamber buried beneath the earth itself. It was round, circular like a wheel, and along its edges, masks hung on pegs, dozens of them. Wooden, bronze, porcelain, sad, grinning, angry. Regal masks of kings and queens, of jesters and peasants. This is where they all begin, she said. Every story, every lie. He looked around in awe. What is this? Our memory, she answered. We collect what others forget. And from a long, dusty shelf, she pulled a scroll and handed it to him. It bore the broken seal of the house, Celesta family of the Queen Mother. Marius opened it slowly, and when his eyes scanned the parchment, his jaw tensed. This, this is treason. Isabetta's gaze was sharp. This is your mother. In the candlelight, his face turned pale. There, in spidery ink, were details of transactions, dates, poisons sent to the kitchens, guards reassigned at curious hours, and at the bottom, an unfinished signature. Her hand faltered before sealing this. I thought she had protected me, he whispered, but she was preparing for my fall. She still is, Lysandra said, now behind them, and she will succeed unless you act swiftly. He looked between them, two women, hidden in a world beneath the city. One clothed in velvet command, the other in silent fury. You've been waiting for this, he said. Isabetta nodded. And now you will wait no longer. That night, they made the pact, not of love, not even of loyalty, but of purpose. To move against the ones who moved unseen, the brothel would become their court. Its chambers, whispers, its women, messengers, and the masks would be worn again. Each girl would choose her role. Some would vanish into noble courts, others into merchant houses. Some would even take to the streets disguised as beggars or fools, because war would not be fought with swords, but with secrets, and every secret had a mother. The candle's wick sputtered in its final hour, a tiny tongue of flame whispering against the velvet dark, and within the winding maze of the house of silk, the air was thick with a silence that felt not empty but full of farewells, not yet spoken, of stories yearning for closure. The silks hung lower that night, brushing against the tiled floors like mourning veils, and the scent of camellias had turned melancholy, like a perfume worn by someone long gone. Aimi stood alone in the garden that once welcomed dancers and drunken laughter. The lanterns were dim. The koi fish swirled lazily in the pond, unaware that the woman who had once sung them lullabies might be gone by dawn. Her fingertips trailed along the bamboo edge, where once Sadao had slipped a poem. There was no paper. Now, no message, just memory. Madame Hannah's voice no longer echoed through the corridor. She had been gone for weeks, taken away in a palanquin, borne by men with folded scrolls and imperial crests. They said she had been summoned to Kyoto. Others whispered she was punished for protecting girls like a Me Too, old-fashioned, too soft for the new age. Whatever the truth, her presence had vanished like incense smoke. In her absence, the house had changed. Faster music, rougher patrons. The sake flowed like water, but the laughter was brittle. Aimi found herself performing not to be seen, but to disappear, to blend into the silken atmosphere and become another illusion in a house of ghosts. Her steps on the stage were still graceful, but her heart had grown quiet. It no longer fluttered when coins clinked into bowls, or when men whispered compliments like sharpened blades. Sadao had not returned. Each evening she stood by the edge of the screen near the outer gate, pretending to arrange her hair or adjust her obi, hoping the street would offer his shadow. But none came. Only the rumble of ox carts, the chatter of drunken officers, and the cold sweep of wind filled the night. And so she buried her longing under layers of painted smiles, letting the house of silk consume her hour by hour, until one night a scroll arrived, sealed with the emblem of the Southern Fleet. It was handed to her by a quiet man with sea-worn eyes. She broke the wax seal, fingers trembling. To Aimi of the autumn eyes, I have sailed further than the moon's reach, past the coral reefs where the stars fall into the sea. I send this to say, I did not forget. I return before winter's breath stiffens the sakura trees. Wait for me beneath the red lantern. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she folded into herself like silk in the rain. Her breath caught, not from grief, but from something long foreign, hope. She waited every dusk. She adorned herself in crimson, the color she wore when he first saw her hand stood beneath the red lantern by the outer corridor. Days passed, weeks, then a month. No ship's bell, no voice in the wind, until, on the night of the season's first frost, she heard the gates would creak open. She turned. A man stood in the lantern's shadow. He was thinner, his hair longer, eyes deeper. But the way he stood still, as though afraid the moment would vanish if he moved, was unmistakable. Sadao, ... double quotes, she whispered. He took one step, then another. When he reached her, they didn't speak. Words would have been too sharp, too crude. Instead, he cupped her cheek in a calloused hand and pressed his forehead to hers, as though anchoring himself in something real after too long lost at sea. She didn't ask where he had been. He didn't ask if she had waited for anyone else. There, silence spoke for them. In the days that followed, the House of Silk became aware of his presence. Rumors spiraled like the scent of sake. A naval officer returning for a courtesan. A marriage forbidden but whispered about in corners. But Madame Hannah was gone. No one stopped them. And one day, the red lantern was gone to dot the room Aimi once called hers stood empty. Her koto lay untouched. But for those who stayed in the house long after, there were stories of a courtesan who once danced so tenderly that the blind could feel it, of a girl with autumn eyes who dared to wait in a world that devoured waiting, of a man who returned from the sea not for glory, but for her. And they said, sometimes, if the wind was just right, you could hear a melody in the garden, the ghost of a love song, played on strings no longer there. And though time swept over the House of Silk, smoothing its once scandalous tales into legend, the echo of their love remained, for not every flame burns brightly. Some glow gently, quietly, and never go out